Hello everyone, welcome back to Unveiling Mythical Legends. Today, we will dive into the legendary history of ancient Greece and explore the series of untold tragedies and heroes' journeys home after the Trojan War. This seemingly glorious victory, however, triggered countless disasters, from Agamemnon's family tragedy to Odysseus' perilous voyage. Each story is filled with dramatic twists and profound destinies. From the curses of the gods to the rise of heroes, we will follow the footsteps of these legendary figures and delve into how they face the challenges of gods and fate. If you enjoy such mythological stories, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on future exciting videos. In the brutal war that led to the fall of Troy, the Greek army's victory did not bring the glory it deserved. Instead, it marked the beginning of a series of tragedies. The fall of Troy was not only due to the bravery in battle, but because the Greek army committed sacrilegious and cruel acts at the moment of victory. These actions provoked the anger of the Romans and the gods, laying the groundwork for the disasters that would befall the Greek heroes on their journey home. The road home for these heroes was filled with hardships and misfortunes, and many of them died in accidents or disasters before reaching their homeland, making what should have been a triumphant victory seem unusually heavy. After enduring a long and arduous journey, brave heroes such as Nestor, Diomedes, Philoctetes, and Neoptolemus finally arrived safely back in their homeland of Greece. While these individuals successfully returned to their homeland, not all heroes were so fortunate. Menelaus and Helen's ship encountered a violent storm on their return journey, which blew them to the distant shores of Egypt. This sudden disaster led to many years of wandering and suffering, and it wasn't until several years later that they were able to return to Sparta and reunite with their homeland. However, not everyone's fate was as fortunate. Ajax the Lesser, once a valiant hero, met a tragic end after the Trojan War due to his arrogance and sacrilege against the gods. After the fall of Troy, Ajax desecrated the temple of Pallas Athena, angering the powerful goddess. This overconfident hero met his death near the Cape of Caphareus. When he boasted that he no longer needed the gods' help, his actions enraged the sea god Poseidon. Poseidon, wielding his trident, struck the rock that Ajax was clinging to, splitting it apart. In an instant, the proud hero was swallowed by the waves, ending his once bright fate. As for Agamemnon's journey home, it was filled with twists and tragedy. After the victory in the Trojan War, he returned with his soldiers and valuable spoils, but little did he know that awaiting him was not a joyful homecoming, but a deep conspiracy and a painful fate. First, Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, was filled with the flames of revenge. Her daughter, Iphigenia, had been sacrificed by Agamemnon himself to appease the goddess Artemis. This painful decision deeply wounded her and became an unhealable scar in her heart. Her pain turned into hatred, and that hatred became her ruthless motivation for revenge against her husband. So, when Agamemnon returned from his campaign, Clytemnestra secretly allied with Odysseus, the son of Thyestes, and plotted to murder the victorious hero. However, Agamemnon's return did not begin with tragedy. When he arrived in Mycenae, he was still greeted with the warmth and affection of his wife. Clytemnestra pretended to be overjoyed to see him, causing the weary traveler to let down his guard. She had carefully prepared a warm bath for him, hoping to help him relax and regain his strength. Unfortunately, this comfort was nothing more than a deadly trap hidden beneath the surface. As Agamemnon bathed, Odysseus, hiding in the room next door, rushed in and swiftly murdered the once mighty hero in the bath. To die at the hands of his wife was not only a blow to Agamemnon's body, but also an irreversible strike to his soul. However, this was not the end of the story. The moment Agamemnon fell, the tragedy of his family had only just begun. His daughter Electra, though filled with grief, did not lose her sense of reason. Calm and determined, she began to plan how to rescue her brother, Orestes. This family conspiracy filled her heart with conflict and inner turmoil. But she understood that the only way to restore her family's honor was through revenge. Orestes' fate was even more tragic than that of his father. At the time, he was still a young boy and did not witness the scene of his father's murder. To save his life, he was sent to his uncle Strophius' court, where he formed a deep friendship with his cousin Pylades. The bond between them was like that of brothers. They grew up side by side, supporting each other. This friendship would later pave the way for Orestes' revenge. Not only did Orestes seek vengeance for his father, but he also had to confront the crimes of his mother, Clytemnestra. When Orestes grew older, filled with the determination for revenge, he returned to Mycenae with Pylades. To avoid raising suspicion from his mother, he cleverly devised a plan, sending a messenger to inform Clytemnestra that Orestes had tragically died in a contest at Delphi. This rumor created an opportunity for Orestes' return, allowing him to secretly approach his mother without being recognized. When Orestes returned to Mycenae, he found his sister Electra in deep sorrow, which only strengthened his resolve for revenge. In that moment, Orestes finally revealed his identity and explained to his sister the true purpose of his return. At that point, Electra's grief made her recall how her mother had treated her cruelly, and the news of her father's death brought her a sense of relief. In such circumstances, Orestes' fury and desire for revenge could no longer be suppressed, and he was determined to strike at his mother's heart with the sharpness of a sword. Orestes' revenge on Clytemnestra became one of the most tragic parent-child killings in history. While the deaths of his mother and her lover saved Orestes' family, they also plunged him into immense pain and torment. The gods' vengeance would not easily spare anyone because of human emotions or actions. Once the Furies, the goddesses of vengeance, set their sights on a target, they would follow relentlessly, never letting go. The Furies, the goddesses of vengeance, began to relentlessly pursue Orestes, no matter where he fled. These goddesses would haunt him like ghosts, making it impossible for him to escape. In his desperation, Orestes went to the temple of Delphi, seeking help from the god Apollo. Apollo heard his plea and instructed him to go to Chersonesus, retrieve the statue of Artemis, and bring it back to the kingdom of Attica. This arduous task not only meant physical and mental torment, but also posed a life-and-death adventure. However, even though Orestes successfully completed this difficult task on the shores of Taurus, the Furies were still unwilling to release him. Orestes could not escape their pursuit until he encountered the goddess of justice and wisdom, Athena. Athena's appearance became the key to Orestes' escape from the relentless chase. Not only did she make the Furies relent, but she also granted him inner peace and comfort. Ultimately, Orestes returned to Argos, succeeded his father on the throne, and married Hermione, the daughter of Helen and Menelaus. This marriage symbolized new life and rebirth, as well as the restoration of his family. However, this did not mean that peace had fully come, as the destinies of Orestes and Electra were still shaped by the past tragedies. Later, Orestes arranged for his sister Electra to marry his faithful friend Pylades, marking a form of release from the suffering he had endured. Although his life had been filled with conflict and hatred, under the guidance of the gods, he found balance and offered a glimmer of hope for the future. Odysseus' journey home was not as simple as he had hoped. Carrying the precious treasures plundered from the Trojan War, filled with hope and anticipation, he originally planned to return smoothly to his homeland in Ithaca. For him, this was a long-awaited homecoming. 10 years of war were finally behind him, and his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, were waiting for him. He eagerly looked forward to embracing them again, Yet fate had a cruel joke in store for this hero. During the long journey, Odysseus' fleet was forced to seek shelter due to sudden bad weather. Arriving at a secluded place, the inhabitants there led a completely different way of life, relying on a magical plant called the lotus to survive. This lotus was an incredibly seductive food, as sweet as honey and irresistible. Once someone tasted it, they would fall into a strange, intoxicating state, forgetting their homeland and country, even desiring to stay forever in this foreign land. Odysseus and his men were warmly welcomed by the locals, with the lotus becoming a regular offering. The people seemed unsurprised by the arrival of outsiders, acting more like gracious hosts as they generously offered the lotus. After Odysseus tasted this sweet food, his companions also began to devour it hungrily. However, as they became intoxicated by the aroma and sweetness of the food, Odysseus sensed that something was wrong. His warriors, once brave and fearless, began to grow sluggish and dazed. The fire of determination that once burned in their eyes was gone, replaced by a sense of being bound by some mysterious force, passively immersed in the comfort of this land. Odysseus quickly realized that these foods were not ordinary gifts, but were a trap designed to make people lose themselves and forget their past. He watched his former comrades, now trapped in an inescapable confusion, and a sense of anxiety and panic rose in his heart. The wise hero was not deceived by the enchanting land. He knew that if he did not act swiftly, he and his men would never escape this magical shadow. So, Odysseus made a decisive choice, forcibly dragging his lost comrades away from that beautiful land. Even if it meant using force, he did not hesitate to pull them back to the ship, ready to set sail once again. When Odysseus' fleet sailed into an unfamiliar sea, despite countless previous adventures, he was still filled with a thirst for the unknown. When their ship docked on a distant small island, Odysseus led 12 of his elite companions toward a cave on the island. This cave seemed like a scene straight out of myth, carrying an aura of mystery and ominousness. The interior of the cave was spacious and unusually rich. It was filled with large blocks of golden cheese and several barrels of milk, the scent of which tempted Odysseus' companions to taste them. Everything seemed perfect, and their love for adventure led them to explore unfamiliar food and surroundings. However, it also revealed a hint of reckless daring, lacking sufficient caution. Odysseus' companions instinctively wanted to return to the ship immediately, but Odysseus believed that the place might conceal some astonishing secret. So he ordered everyone to stay inside the cave, waiting for the owner of the place to arrive. Finally, night fell, and a terrifying figure appeared before them. This giant, carrying a massive load of firewood on his shoulders, was herding a flock of sheep. Known as Polyphemus, the Cyclops, he demonstrated immense strength and an undeniable threat. After driving the sheep into his cave, he rolled a massive stone, large enough to block the combined strength of hundreds of men, over the entrance, sealing the cave shut. Then, Polyphemus started a fire, preparing to enjoy his meal. Meanwhile, Odysseus and his companions could only watch helplessly, filled with fear and helplessness. The giant showed nothing but hostility towards the group, completely ignoring their pleas, and instead casually grabbed 2 sailors, slammed them to the ground, and proceeded to devour them, washing down the gruesome meal with milk. This scene made Odysseus begin to doubt. Perhaps this adventure was not a mere exploration, but a life-and-death trial. As night fully descended, Odysseus engaged in careful contemplation. Despite his remarkable intelligence, he realized that in this situation, sheer strength alone would be useless against the giant. He knew that if he didn't act wisely, all of his companions would meet their doom. That night, he and his men decided to wait for the right moment, preparing to exploit Polyphemus's weaknesses. The next morning, Polyphemus once again devoured two unfortunate companions before driving his sheep out of the cave. Odysseus knew this was their only chance, so he began to put his plan into motion. First, he offered the giant a large cup of wine, a potent vintage strong enough to make anyone lose their senses. After tasting the drink, the giant seemed delighted and started to engage in conversation with Odysseus. When Polyphemus asked his name, Odysseus cleverly replied that he was called Nobody, a name that made the giant trust him more and lower his guard. The alcohol quickly took its toll, and Polyphemus soon fell into a deep sleep. It was then that Odysseus's plan moved into its final stage. He instructed his companions to prepare their weapons, and they chopped down a large olive branch from outside the cave. After heating it in the fire, they thrust the sharpened end into Polyphemus's single eye. The moment the giant screamed in agony, his cries echoed through the valley, and the entire cave seemed to tremble from the force of his torment. However, this was not the end. Polyphemus, groping in pain, called out, and his brothers, hearing his cries, hurried to ask what had happened. But when Polyphemus loudly told them, "Nobody is hurting me," they all assumed he was joking and chose to ignore him leaving. Although Polyphemus was blind, he did not give up hope. He continued to search futilely in the cave, trying to catch the sailors who had wronged him. Eventually, Odysseus displayed his usual cunning. He decided to use the sheep as a means of escape. Cleverly, he tied the sheep together and hid each of his men beneath their wool. This way, when the giant checked the sheep, he failed to notice that Odysseus and his companions were quietly escaping the cave. After narrowly escaping, Odysseus and his men quickly boarded their ship, their hearts racing as they sailed away from the terrifying island. Odysseus thought they had completely escaped danger, but just as he let down his guard, he made a decisive mistake. He stood on the ship and loudly shouted his true name, taunting Polyphemus by saying, "I am Odysseus." This provocation immediately enraged the giant. Polyphemus roared and called out to his father, Poseidon, asking for help and seeking revenge. Then, with incredible strength, Polyphemus began hurling massive rocks into the sea, almost hitting Odysseus's ship. But his revenge didn't end there. Polyphemus begged Poseidon to curse Odysseus, ensuring that he would face endless hardships on his journey home, until he returned in misery and despair. After a long voyage, Odysseus and his followers finally arrived at the island of Aeolus, the king of the winds. This deity, who controlled the winds, greeted Odysseus and his companions with great enthusiasm and kindness. He hosted them warmly and allowed them to stay on the island for a whole month. When they were ready to continue their journey, Aeolus gave Odysseus a special gift, a large bag made of oxhide, sealed with all the unfavorable winds. Aeolus told Odysseus that the bag contained the winds that would protect them and ensure a swift and safe journey to the coast of Greece. He warned Odysseus not to open the bag, allowing only the west wind to blow gently, which would carry them safely to their destination. However, after 10 days of sailing, Odysseus and his fleet finally saw the beacon fires of Ithaca in the distance, and they were almost home. But Odysseus was exhausted. At this point, his companions, curious about the contents of the bag, believed that the unfavorable winds might be treasure. So, while Odysseus slept, they opened the bag. Immediately, all the winds rushed out like a flood, sending the fleet back to Aeolus's island. When they arrived back at Aeolus's island, the king of the winds no longer welcomed them. Instead, he harshly scolded them, expressing his disappointment in Odysseus and his companions for breaking his command. Reluctantly, Odysseus and his fleet set out once more on their long journey. After 6 days of sailing, they finally saw land in the distance. Odysseus thought this might be a prosperous city. He sent a messenger and 2 companions to gather supplies, But when they arrived, they discovered they had come to the land of the Laestrygonians, a fierce race of cannibals. The king, Antiphates, led a group of giant, powerful cannibals who swiftly captured the messenger and brutally killed him. Fortunately, the two companions managed to escape in time and returned to the ship to warn Odysseus. However, the disaster did not stop there. The cannibal giants then grabbed enormous rocks and hurled them at the fleet, instantly sinking 11 ships and devouring all the sailors. The only ship to survive was the one commanded by Odysseus. After this calamity, Odysseus and the few remaining companions set sail once again, but they were soon blown off course by the adverse winds to a mysterious island called Ajax. At last, Odysseus and his men arrived at Ajax, a beautiful and fertile place. In dire need of supplies, Odysseus decided to send a portion of his crew to scout the area. This time, he drew lots, and the team led by Eurylochus was selected to explore. They soon came upon a magnificent palace situated in a beautiful valley, surrounded by dense forests. The palace was made entirely of white marble, shining brilliantly. This was the home of the legendary witch, Circe, the daughter of the sun god Helios and the sea nymph Perse. The palace was guarded by wolves and lions, yet when the crew approached, they found that these fierce beasts behaved as tame as lambs, showing no intention of attacking. Upon entering the palace, the crew heard a beautiful voice coming from within. It was Circe, singing as she wove a magical web. Her voice was so enchanting that it was irresistible, drawing them closer. She warmly invited them in, and except for the cautious Eurylochus, the rest of the men, without a second thought, stepped into the mesmerizing palace. As they entered, the crew found the palace to be extravagantly decorated, with marble walls and soft carpets covering the floors. Circe welcomed them and prepared a lavish feast, with delicious food and wine served in golden vessels. The men enjoyed the feast to the fullest, completely relaxing their guard. However, hidden beneath the beauty of the meal was a deadly trap. It turned out that the food and wine had been laced with the witch's evil potion. After drinking, the men immediately transformed into pigs. Though they retained their human senses, they could no longer exist in human form. When Odysseus learned of his companion's tragic fate, he did not hesitate and decided to rescue them personally. Despite the great danger, he was determined to reach Circe's palace. Along the way, he encountered a handsome young man holding a golden staff, who revealed himself to be Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Hermes looked at Odysseus and gently chided him for venturing into the witch's dwelling without being prepared with the antidote. He gave Odysseus a special herb called moly, which could counteract Circe's magic and prevent him from turning into a monster after drinking her potion. Hermes also advised Odysseus that when the witch tried to cast her spell, he should draw his sword and bravely charge at her as if he intended to take her life. This would cause Circe to recognize him and force her to lift the spell. When Odysseus arrived at Circe's palace, he followed Hermes' instructions and accepted the wine that the witch had prepared for him. However, the potion in the cup had no effect on him because he had already consumed the antidote Hermes had given him. He then drew his sword and bravely charged at Circe. When Circe realized that her magic could no longer control the hero, she was shocked to realize that this was the Odysseus foretold by Hermes. She understood that she could no longer continue her tricks on him. At Odysseus' request, Circe immediately lifted the curse she had placed on his companions, restoring them to their human form. She also promised that neither he nor his men would be harmed by her magic again. However, when Circe began to tempt Odysseus, the hero forgot the earlier warnings. Under her sweet words, he gradually let down his guard and ended up staying with her on the island for an entire year. Although he knew it was not the right choice, he was captivated by the witch's charms. It wasn't until Odysseus' companions persistently begged him to leave and reminded him that they had to continue their journey. That Odysseus finally, upon his friend's urging, left the grasp of Circe. Circe was deeply reluctant to see him go. Despite the magic she had once cast on him, she couldn't resist her attachment to him. In the end, she prophesied to Odysseus that his future journey would be filled with challenges and dangers, and told him that in order to survive, he must seek the help of the god of the underworld, Hades, and consult the blind prophet Tiresias for guidance on the future. Circe also prepared provisions for Odysseus' voyage and reluctantly bid him farewell. Odysseus and his companions' arduous journey seemed endless. Following Circe's warnings and guidance, they began their journey to find the entrance to the underworld. Despite the fear of venturing into the dark realm where the souls of the dead resided, Odysseus obeyed the goddess' instructions, preparing himself to face the unknown fate. Circe not only told him where to go, but also emphasized several crucial prohibitions and reminded him to be cautious and careful in his actions. After a long and difficult voyage, they finally arrived at a gloomy land, the realm of the Cimmerians, the end of the world, located far to the west, across the sea from Oceania. The place was covered in dark clouds, and an oppressive atmosphere seemed to permeate the air, as if a shadow of death hung over it. Following Circe's instructions, Odysseus came to a special location, where the rivers Acheron and Cocytus met. This was the entrance to the underworld. The place was desolate and eerie, with only the dark river waters and the cold, bitter air, as though signaling that he was about to enter a completely different world. Despite his fear, Odysseus bravely set foot on land. He began the sacrificial rites as Circe had instructed. He dug a trench and let the blood of the offerings flow into it, presenting a black ram and a ewe. As the blood seeped into the earth, strange phenomena began to occur. Hordes of shadows rose from the bottomless abyss and gathered around him. These shadows longed to drink the sacrificial blood, which momentarily revived their spirits and allowed them to experience some semblance of their former lives. However, Odysseus remembered Circe's warning and kept his sword drawn, vigilantly guarding against any ghost approaching him. He did not allow any of them near until the one he had most hoped to see, the blind prophet Tiresias, finally appeared. The arrival of Tiresias brought Odysseus a sense of hope. The great prophet, leaning on his golden staff, slowly approached Odysseus. After drinking the sacrificial blood, he began to reveal the truth of Odysseus' future fate. Tiresias told Odysseus that his journey home would be fraught with danger, and that on his way back to Ithaca, he would face even more difficult challenges. He offered Odysseus valuable guidance on how to avoid these dangers and provided crucial advice for his future adventures. However, as more and more ghosts gathered around the sacrifice, Odysseus' heart grew heavier. Among the shadows, Odysseus recognized his beloved mother, Anticlea. She told him that because of his long absence, she could not bear the loneliness and sorrow, and eventually fell ill and died. This news struck Odysseus like a dagger to the heart. He felt immense guilt and was deeply pained by the loss of his mother. Next, he encountered his brave comrades from the past, Agamemnon, Patroclus, and Achilles. Achilles' words profoundly moved Odysseus. The once great hero now displayed immense sorrow in the underworld, lamenting that he would rather be the poorest laborer on earth than remain in that dark world as the king of the dead. However, what shocked Odysseus the most was his encounter with Ajax. Ajax did not extend his hand to Odysseus. Instead, when Odysseus tried to speak with him, he coldly turned his back and walked away. Filled with resentment, he was still unable to forgive the humiliation he had suffered in the past. This made Odysseus feel even more alone and helpless. When he realized that he could no longer gain any answers from these shadows, his courage began to fade. Overwhelmed by fear and helplessness, he hurriedly withdrew back to his ship. Odysseus and his men then arrived at the legendary island of the Sirens, these mysterious creatures, half woman and half bird, who lured passing sailors with their enchanting songs, causing them to lose themselves and ultimately meet a tragic death. Circe had long warned Odysseus not to be seduced by these treacherous nymphs, for once he heard their song, no matter how strong his will, he would not be able to resist the irresistible desire. The inevitable outcome would be to be swallowed by the sea, or to die at the hands of the Sirens on the island. However, Odysseus, the natural adventurer, could not pass up such a dangerous yet tempting challenge. He decided to face it, to experience the allure of the Siren's song, and to test his limits. He thought that if he could remain clear-headed in the face of such danger, it might prove his courage and wisdom. So, Odysseus ordered that all the sailors' ears be sealed with wax, so they couldn't hear the Siren's song, ensuring their safety. As for himself, he didn't want to miss out on the adventure. He decided to be voluntarily tied to the mast of the ship and ordered his men to strictly follow his instructions. No matter how much he begged, they were not to untie him until they had sailed far away from the deadly island. As the ship approached the Sirens' Island, Odysseus and his men saw the Sirens sitting on the lush green hills. Their singing was like an invisible magic that filled the entire sea with temptation. When those sweet, seductive melodies reached Odysseus's ears, he was immediately overwhelmed by an intense desire. As if the whole world became blurry, he desperately pleaded with his men to release him, to let him listen to the beautiful song, to succumb to that irresistible temptation. However, the sailors remained firm, following Odysseus's orders without wavering. They did not give in to the hero's pleas, and only when they had completely sailed away from the island, the image of the island fading in the distance, did they finally untie the ropes that bound Odysseus. Next, Odysseus had to face the infamous sea monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, like the death gods of the sea, mercilessly waiting for any ship that dared enter their domain. Circe had already foretold that Odysseus would have to navigate between the two, choosing the most difficult path. As he steered his ship towards the dark waters, the huge rocks ahead suddenly loomed. Scylla, like a terrifying serpentine monster, leaped out, snatching 6 innocent sailors. Their desperate screams echoed in the sea breeze, becoming a nightmare that Odysseus would never forget. However, this disaster did not slow down Odysseus. Next, they arrived at the island of Thrinacia, a sacred place said to be the land where the sun god Helios pastured his cattle. Odysseus clearly remembered that Tiresias had warned him to avoid this island, but as they approached, the sailors' desires became uncontrollable. They felt an irresistible pull towards the land and decided to stop and explore. Odysseus, though reluctant, yielded, even though he had given strict orders to his men not to touch Helios' sacred cattle, vowing to leave the next day. Unfortunately, the weather worsened, and they were forced to stay on the island for a full month. The food on the island gradually ran out, and the provisions Circe had left for them were long gone. In order to survive, they had to rely on the sparse fish and birds on the island to fill their hunger. Despite this, hunger and exhaustion pushed them to the brink of collapse. One unfortunate night, the sailor Eurylochus, taking advantage of the group's hunger, persuaded them to break their oath and slaughter some of Helios' sacred cattle. This action would undoubtedly bring doom upon the entire crew. Helios was enraged by this, and the fiery wrath that descended from the heavens nearly scorched the entire world. He caused the skins of the slain sacred cattle to twitch, and the joints on the roasting spits to emit a roar like that of living cattle. It seemed as though this was the cruelest punishment for those who had shown such disrespect. He threatened that if Zeus did not avenge this wrong, he would withdraw his light, plunging the world into darkness. Zeus was forced to agree to avenge Helios, which would later set the stage for Odysseus' tragic fate. When Odysseus and his men were finally ready to set sail, Zeus' fury erupted mercilessly. A terrible storm suddenly struck. The waves surged violently, and lightning struck the ship, shattering it into pieces. All the sailors perished in the disaster, and only Odysseus miraculously survived. He clung to a broken mast and began drifting aimlessly in the vast ocean. 9 days later, when he had almost given up all hope, he was washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, a desolate island that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in his fate. Ogygia was a mysterious and enchanting place, with lush forests surrounded by tall, green cypress and poplar trees. The landscape of the island was picturesque, especially the stone cave palace that stood on the island, as though it were the home of a secluded nymph. The palace belonged to Calypso, a beautiful nymph and the daughter of the Titan Atlas. The entrance to her palace was hidden behind a dense canopy of grapevines, with hanging grapes sparkling in the sunlight, some purple, some golden, like jewels scattered throughout. Fountains around the palace gently splashed water, filling the air with a cool breeze that seemed to relax and refresh with every breath. Birds sang from the branches, and the ground was covered with fragrant violets and soft moss, all showcasing the beauty and tranquility of this mysterious island. For this lonely hero, Calypso provided unwavering care and did everything she could to fulfill his every need. She seemed to regard Odysseus as her sole companion, growing deeply attached to him over their long time together. She offered Odysseus immortality and eternal youth, asking him to spend eternity with her, living a carefree life. But Odysseus could not remove the thoughts from his heart. The deep longing for his wife, Penelope, and his young son, Telemachus, became an unbreakable bond he could not sever. Even though Calypso provided him with everything, his heart still longed to return to his homeland, to the familiar land, and to be with the ones he loved. Odysseus pleaded with the gods, asking to return home. However, Poseidon's curse, like an invisible chain, still tightly bound the hero. Though Calypso deeply loved Odysseus, she could not resist the fate that had been imposed on him. In her helplessness, she kept Odysseus trapped on the island and silently prayed that one day he could escape all of this. Finally, divine intervention came. Pallas Athena, in order to help Odysseus, pleaded with her powerful father, Zeus. Zeus listened to the goddess's request and commanded the swift and agile Hermes to go to Calypso, telling her that she must release Odysseus and provide him with the means to leave the island. Though Calypso did not want to part with Odysseus, she knew she could not defy Zeus's command. At the god's direction, she had no choice but to teach Odysseus how to build a raft, and she personally wove the sail for the raft to help him return to the sea and journey home. Once everything was prepared, Odysseus and Calypso bid each other a bittersweet farewell. He knew this would be their final meeting. Despite the sorrow in his heart, Odysseus could never relinquish his longing for his homeland. Alone, he set sail on the fragile raft, beginning his long and lonely journey toward his distant homeland. After a long and perilous sea journey, Odysseus finally arrived on the shores of Phaeacia on the 18th day, his heart filled with hope, eager to rest on this land and seek refuge. However, Poseidon's wrath had not yet subsided. The sea god, still harboring his old grudge against Odysseus for blinding his son, decided to strike again. A terrible storm came upon him once more. The fierce waves capsized Odysseus' raft, and all hope seemed to vanish in an instant. Odysseus could only cling to the broken pieces of the raft, struggling desperately to survive in the midst of the tempest. He drifted on the sea for 2 days and nights, the storm raging around him, with darkness enveloping everything. Odysseus almost believed he would never escape this maritime disaster. Just as despair was overtaking him, the sea goddess Leucothea appeared. Sympathetic to the unyielding hero, she rescued him from the towering waves and pushed him toward the shore of Scheria, the island of the Phaeacians. This island was the home of the luxurious Phaeacians. At this moment, Odysseus was utterly exhausted, unable to resist any longer. He felt his knees in the bushes, then lay down on a bed of dry leaves and fell into a deep sleep, perhaps dreaming of his distant homeland. Coincidentally, the king of the island, Alcinous, and his wife, Queen Arete, along with their daughter Nausicaa and her maidens, had come to the shore to wash the linens used for a wedding. After finishing their task, they bathed, shared a meal, sang, played ball, and enjoyed their time together. At that moment, their laughter woke Odysseus, and he was astonished to find himself amidst this joyful group of people. Nausicaa's maidens, seeing his filthy, unkempt appearance, were frightened and ran away in panic. However, Nausicaa felt a deep sympathy for the unfortunate stranger. She approached him, gently inquiring about his plight, and patiently listened to his account of the shipwreck and the many hardships he had endured. After hearing his story, Nausicaa immediately scolded her maidens for their lack of courtesy and ordered them to prepare food, drinks, and clothes for Odysseus. She also personally comforted him. Then, she instructed her maidens to continue their game, while Odysseus was allowed to bathe and change into the clean clothes they had prepared for him. At that moment, the goddess Athena appeared and endowed Odysseus with a dignified bearing and extraordinary beauty, making him appear like a god. When he reappeared, Nausicaa was amazed by the transformation, admiring him greatly, and immediately invited him to visit her father's palace. She ordered her attendants to prepare a carriage and mule to take Odysseus back to her home. Odysseus was warmly welcomed by the king and queen, who provided him with food, drinks, and comfortable lodging. In return for their kindness, Odysseus recounted his long journey since leaving Ilium, sharing the various miracles and dangers he had encountered along the way. He spoke of his life-or-death struggles with the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis, as well as his encounters with mythical creatures and the countless perilous adventures, moving all who listened. When Odysseus was about to bid farewell to the hospitable royal couple, King Alcinous generously presented him with rich gifts and ordered a ship to safely return him to his homeland of Ithaca. Following King Alcinous's instructions, the deck was covered with luxurious furs to provide a comfortable environment for his guest. The hero entrusted the navigation of the ship to the Phaeacian sailors, and soon fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, when the ship arrived at the harbor of Ithaca, the sailors, seeing how soundly he was sleeping, believed it was a gift from the gods, so they did not disturb him. They gently lifted him ashore and placed him under the shade of an olive tree. When Odysseus awoke, he found himself lying beneath the olive tree, surrounded by an unfamiliar landscape. At that moment, his heart was filled with confusion and unease. This was neither the homeland he knew, nor the shore he had ever seen. While he was still wondering where he was, Pallas Athena appeared before him in the guise of a shepherd, radiating her mysterious glow. She told Odysseus that he had finally returned to Ithaca, the land that once belonged to him, the homeland had dreamed of countless times. Hearing this news, Odysseus felt a mixture of excitement and complexity in his heart. Although he had finally returned, he found that the situation in his homeland was far from the peaceful and serene state he had hoped for. Pallas Athena told him that his father, Laertes, was now old and, due to excessive sorrow and the ravages of time, had withdrawn from the court and was living in seclusion. As for his son, Telemachus, he had grown into adulthood and was traveling far and wide in search of his father. These revelations filled Odysseus's heart with intense emotion and sorrow. While he had finally returned to his homeland, he had unfortunately missed the chance to reunite with his family. What weighed even heavier on Odysseus's heart was the fact that his wife, Penelope, was still being harassed by a group of unruly suitors. These suitors had taken over his house, consumed his wealth, and caused great distress to her life. Though Penelope refused to remarry, she promised that she would not choose another husband until she had finished weaving a funeral shroud for her aged father-in-law, Laertes. However, this clever wife of his skillfully unraveled a part of the cloth she had woven each night, so the weaving would never be completed, thus delaying her remarriage indefinitely. Although this strategy worked, it also attracted more intense harassment and pressure from the suitors. Her sorrowful yet determined actions not only demonstrated her deep loyalty to Odysseus, but also filled him with boundless gratitude and love for his wife, Penelope. When Odysseus heard about these circumstances, his heart was filled with intense emotion. After 20 long years of separation, he was finally standing once again on this familiar land, facing the homeland he had once fought so fiercely to defend. Odysseus could no longer suppress his feelings. He fell to the ground and kissed the earth passionately, as if to release all the suffering and waiting of these years in one breath. 20 years, for a hero, may seem like just a moment in history, but for a husband and father who had lost everything and wandered in solitude, those 20 years were long and painful. Now, Odysseus had finally returned home. This was not only the end of his heroic journey, but also the return to the deep emotions he held for his family and his homeland. The goddess Athena revealed her identity to Odysseus and offered him selfless help throughout his difficult journey back home. This time, her plan was to have Odysseus return to Ithaca without being recognized by anyone. So, she transformed him into an old, ragged beggar, allowing him to return to his homeland in a humble guise. When he first set foot on this familiar land, Odysseus's body had become extremely frail. His limbs were like aged branches, his brown hair had vanished, and his eyes were no longer as sharp and piercing as they once were. His clothes, once regal royal garments, were now replaced with a tattered robe, making him appear comical. At this moment, Odysseus no longer resembled the clever and invincible hero he once was. He was simply a beggar, a homeless wanderer with no one to rely on. However, all of this was part of Athena's plan. She knew well that Odysseus's true battle was not merely one of physical combat against the invaders, but rather a contest of wits and strategy. His rebirth had to begin with this disguise, starting as a humble beggar and, layer by layer, revealing the truth. Odysseus's first stop was the humble hut of Eumaeus, the swineherd. This loyal servant, though living in poverty, received the seemingly destitute beggar with great warmth and hospitality. Not only did he provide Odysseus with food and shelter, but he also spoke of his sorrow at losing his master and expressed his anger toward the unlawful invaders. Eumaeus told Odysseus how these shameless suitors had recklessly ravaged the kingdom's resources, slaughtering the finest livestock and consuming the nation's wealth and reputation without hesitation. At this moment, Odysseus's son, Telemachus, finally returned home after his long journey to search for his father. Though his quest had yielded no breakthroughs, he decided to visit Eumaeus' hut. This was a fateful meeting. When Telemachus heard the beggar's story of knowing his father, he was moved, but he did not yet realize that this beggar was his long-lost father. At this point, Athena guided Odysseus to reveal his true identity to his son. Under the goddess's guidance, Odysseus's ragged clothes vanished, replaced by the regal attire of a king. Standing before Telemachus, he was now dressed in the garments of a ruler, his majestic presence restored. Telemachus was initially stunned by the majestic figure before him. He could hardly believe that the person standing before him was his long-lost father. His heart, torn apart by years of disappointment and sorrow, finally found solace. He could not help but throw himself into his father's arms, shedding long-awaited tears. This moment, without a doubt, was one of the most touching in the entire story. In this instant, Odysseus's deep love and longing for his family found its answer. However, the reunion of father and son was not a simple celebration. Odysseus knew, well, that their home was still overrun by unruly suitors, and their presence posed a threat to both the king of Ithaca and its people. Therefore, Odysseus instructed Telemachus to keep their secret and began planning how to deal with the invaders one by one. Everything began with a simple contest. When Odysseus returned to the palace, his loyal dog, Argos, had grown old and weak, but still waited for his master by the door. As Odysseus approached, the faithful old dog, though exhausted, immediately recognized him. It tried to rise to greet his master, but ultimately collapsed in Odysseus's arms, quietly passing away. Upon entering the palace, Odysseus immediately faced the dismissive suitors. They not only mocked his beggar appearance, but some even rudely ordered him to leave. However, when Penelope overheard the disrespectful remarks toward Odysseus, she felt compassion and decided to bring the pitiful beggar before her. She asked him who he was and where he came from. Odysseus cleverly answered that he was a king from Crete and had once met Odysseus, telling her that Odysseus planned to return home by the end of the year. Such an answer filled Penelope's heart with hope. She ordered that a bed be prepared for Odysseus and instructed the old nurse, Euryclea, to wash his feet. As Euryclea washed his feet, she noticed a familiar scar, a mark from when Odysseus was wounded by a wild boar's tusk in his youth. Euryclea almost immediately recognized him, but Odysseus quickly covered her mouth with his hand, stopping her from revealing her emotions, and instructed her to remain silent. In the following days, Penelope arranged a contest to choose her suitor. She took out Odysseus's legendary bow and ordered all the suitors to bend the bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads, promising that the one who succeeded would become her husband. However, none of the suitors could string the bow. Just as they were mocking Odysseus, the beggar requested to try. Even though Odysseus appeared worn and ragged, he was still able to effortlessly string the bow and shoot the arrow through the rings. With that single arrow, he declared the moment of his return. Under Odysseus's guidance, Telemachus swiftly took all the weapons from the suitors, and together they engaged in a fierce battle. This thrilling fight ended with Odysseus's victory, as all the invaders were defeated, and the palace was once again restored to his control. Even though Odysseus had returned home, reuniting with his wife Penelope was not so simple. When Penelope heard the news of Odysseus's return, she descended from the hall and stood before the elderly beggar, but she was unable to recognize that this was the husband she had longed for over the years. The beggar's eyes seemed to hold a familiar expression, but it was not enough to confirm her suspicions. Odysseus did not rush to reveal his identity. Instead, he quietly retreated to the bath. When he emerged from the bath, he radiated a different aura and presence. Athena had granted him renewed youth and the appearance of a brave warrior, making him look like the heroic man he once was. However, Penelope still found it hard to believe. She gazed at this familiar yet unrecognizable beggar, filled with contradictions and doubt in her heart. Penelope, the queen of wisdom and patience, was not easily convinced that the man before her was her long-lost husband. She decided to give him a test to prove his true identity. Penelope, in front of Odysseus, commanded the maidservants to move his bed out of the room. This seemed like a simple command, but for Odysseus, it was a challenge he could not easily fulfill. Why? Because the bed had been made by Odysseus himself. The bedposts were crafted from the trunk of an olive tree that was still rooted in the ground, and the entire bed was surrounded by the walls of the room. Therefore, the bed cannot be moved. When Odysseus heard this command, his reaction immediately astonished Penelope. He exclaimed loudly that it was impossible to move the bed, because only he knew how the bed could not be moved. This task was impossible for anyone else to accomplish. At that moment, Penelope was finally certain that the man standing before her was indeed her long-lost husband, Odysseus. In that instant, the long-separated couple reunited, their love and understanding reaching the deepest level. Their eyes met, and without words, their hearts had already connected. However, even though the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope was filled with emotion, his journey was not yet over. He still had to face another challenge, finding his long-lost father, Laertes. Odysseus went to his father's home and found Laertes focused on digging a young olive tree. He saw his father's face, wrinkled and full of sorrow, yet still resilient. This sight deeply pained Odysseus's heart. For many years, he had known that he had not been by his father's side, and his father had suffered deeply from the long absence of his son. Odysseus quietly told his father that he was the long-lost son. Laertes, overwhelmed with joy and disbelief, could hardly accept the news. When Odysseus carefully led his father inside the house, Laertes' long-lost sense of happiness returned to his heart. In that moment, the reunion between father and son was incredibly touching. Odysseus helped his father put on his royal robes again and thanked the gods for granting him this unexpected joy. However, Odysseus' adventure did not end there. When he returned home, he found that the relatives and friends of the suitors who had previously occupied his house began to rebel against him, chasing him to his father's estate. Although this conflict seemed inevitable, Odysseus chose not to resort to violence. He understood that this struggle was not merely a contest of strength, but a battle of wisdom. After a brief confrontation, Odysseus and his subjects engaged in peaceful negotiations. Ultimately, the suitors' relatives recognized the legitimacy of Odysseus's rule and reached a reconciliation with him. The leaders continued to govern their people in the days that followed, and peace was restored to Ithaca. Well, that's it for today's story. From Odysseus's difficult journey home to the heroes who had great valor but met tragic ends, we can see how mythological figures struggle and persist through the trials of fate. Which character's story do you like the most? Or do you have more questions and thoughts about Greek mythology? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and share this video with your friends so we can all discuss these fascinating mythological tales. And remember to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more amazing historical and mythological stories. See you next time.